Right. Morning, everyone. I'll just get started. I can see a few of you are still joining. So while it fills up, I'll just introduce myself. So my name's Craig. I'm one of the employment law advisors here at Meat House. Some of you hopefully are clients of mine or have spoken to me before. To the rest of you, welcome. I don't know if you've attended any of our previous webinars, but we'll just take 45, 50 minutes, go through a slideshow, give you a bit of a whirlwind tour of the topic, which is discrimination allegations, dealing with them, what comes up in a practical sense when that rears its head. And of course, we'll have a Q&A at the end. I'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So I'll just get started now. So the agenda for today, I'll start with very basics, what discrimination is, what the actual legal tests involved are. Go into a little more detail of what that leads us into, which is the Equality Act 2010, and the main aspects of that being the protected characteristics, what that actually covers. We've then got the types of discrimination, which very broadly are direct and indirect discrimination. I'll go through what those involve. We'll then move to the practical side of things, which is when it comes up, someone raises an issue, someone raises a grievance, what you should ideally be doing, what you should be thinking about. And then the scarier side of the practical aspect, which is what to do when you get a tribunal claim in against you. What might happen, best and worst case scenarios, and how we deal with those. Finally, I'll cover just broadly a bit of the proactive side of things, how to respond, the sort of best practices to have in place, the responses that you might want to have ready to go, if you like, and maybe some of the common pitfalls. We'll then move to a Q&A. So, the legal test of discrimination, and yes, we'll go straight into the Equality Act 2010, which is the next slide as well, but get used to hearing that one. So it sets out the 9 protected characteristics. It protects everyone from being treated less favourably due to these protected characteristics. So an important way to look at this, which I think a lot of people get a little confused about, is that the Equality Act gives everyone rights, but these are negative rights. Rights not to be treated badly, rights not to be discriminated against, rather than any sort of active positive right. I have a right to this because of X. By and large, no, you're just protected against being discriminated against because of X. 2 types of discrimination we have are direct discrimination, which is probably what most of us think of when we think discriminatory acts. It's the on the surface obvious stuff. And that's defined as because of a protected characteristic, A treats B less favourably than A treats or would treat others. You think your classic examples of racist behaviour, sexist behaviour, general bigoted behaviour, that's direct discrimination. The trickier one is indirect discrimination. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's when A applies to B and others, so everyone essentially. Provision, criterion of practice, DCP, which applies to everyone, but it causes a particular disadvantage to B because of a protected characteristic which the others do not share. So things like we want to encourage fitness, so everyone has to take the stairs. That leaves the obviously disabled person in a wheelchair at a particular disadvantage. We're not doing that to them because of that disadvantage, because of that protected characteristic, but it's had a very clear particular detriment to them. Now, if all indirect discrimination situations were as clear-cut as that one, it would make my job a lot easier. But it's one you have to think about. There's a couple of other things covered in the Equality Act that protected against that we won't go into detail today. But that includes harassment, which includes sexual misconduct, a topic that I believe we've done some other webinars and blog posts on recently, because there's now a much more positive, proactive requirement to protect against sexual harassment and misconduct. But it also includes harassment and victimization because you were involved in a discrimination claim. So if you have said that you're discriminated against, or you're supporting someone else who is, and you're mistreated as a result of that, that will likely fall under victimization. But again, there's a lot of minor points like this. We're going to focus on the direct and indirect discrimination aspects. So the protected characteristics. It's worth spending a little more time on these because, again, it's a topic that I think causes a lot of confusion. So Equality Act Section 4 lists them. We have age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy or maternity, and race. And then we have religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. So those of these seem pretty clear cut. And I think the thing that we need to bear in mind, apologies, is that everyone has some of these. Again, a common misconception is that only the minority characteristics are protected, if you like. Men aren't protected against sex discrimination, young people aren't protected against age discrimination, whatever. That's not true. Everyone has some protected characteristics. You are protected equally. And so it's one I've heard a few times. And if this is what you're thinking, do me a favour. Don't say it that, oh, there's nothing to worry about here. This employee has no protected characteristics. I can assure you, they do. But it follows from that that most of these aren't going to be relevant. So if you're looking at a short service dismissal, one where an employee can't claim unfair dismissal because they don't have 2 years service, it's not automatically riskier because they have an obvious protected characteristic here. Another one I've heard, is they want to dismiss this person, they're doing very badly during the probation period, they're performing very poorly, but they're black, they're women, something like that. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter any more than them being white or a man, or the equivalent. Everyone has protected characteristics, and they really need to be. The individual really needs to be able to show that this is relevant in some way to the treatment they've received, to the dismissal, performance management, even if they have a grievance against someone. Why is this protected characteristic you're referring to relevant here? So, as I said, these aren't specific to vulnerable or minority groups, with a few exceptions, I suppose, in that pregnancy and maternity, for example, you do have a few extra rights and protections, which, again, is maybe a little minor to get into here in what is very much an overview, but this is why it's always best to come and talk to us about situations where this is a topic that comes up, because at the end of the day, it's a tricky one. There is nuance to it, but by and large, you should not be scared of just because someone says, you can't discipline me, I have disability. You can't discipline me because of my sex. No, the onus is on them to explain how's that happened. Now, you might be aware of, I'll briefly touch on this because this could take up a whole webinar in itself. There can be overlap between protected characteristics. There can also be tension between them. So, for example, if you say you turn down an applicant for a role and you have asked them at interview, well, are you planning to get pregnant? Are you pregnant? And then you turn them down, they could easily say, well, that's discriminatory. It is. It's not a question you should be asking. Is that discriminating on the grounds of pregnancy/maternity, or is it on the basis of sex? Chances are it's both. Similarly, if you make assumptions about someone's religion because of their race and treat them badly accordingly, chances are that's discrimination based on race and on religion or belief. This just gives them a bit more ammunition against you. At the end of the day, discrimination is discrimination, but it's something to bear in mind. Tension between protected characteristics is also a topic. It's been probably quite prominent in the news the last couple of years. A big one being tension or perceived tension between, for example, gender reassignment and sex. There's a lot of debate on at the moment. There's new guidance coming out on, for example, toilets, changing facilities that people with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment should be using. Should that be with birth sex? Who's being discriminated against here, depending on how it's treated? Okay, that could be at least a whole webinar in itself, but it just shows that, again, this isn't a straightforward topic at all. So again, if it comes up, come to us and we can talk about the details of the case-by-case basis and hopefully give you a steer. And like I said earlier, generally these are negative rights. The rights not to be treated X way. It's rarely going to be a right to demand to be treated in Y way. There are exceptions, disability being a big one. You have the right to request reasonable adjustments for a disability, things like that. But by and large, you don't have specific rights because of your race, sex, whatever, but you have the right not to be treated badly as a result. So on to direct discrimination, which again is kind of the obvious one, if you like, but it's not always obvious. It still needs a little consideration. And that's in Section 13 of the Equality Act. So for direct discrimination, there needs to be a comparator, whether that's real or hypothetical, as long as you can draw comparison with someone else, another situation where someone wouldn't be suffering as a result of you. That's just someone who's in the same circumstances in every way, essentially, other than this protected characteristic. And note that you don't need one of these for pregnancy or maternity. It also has to be a specific protected characteristic, and that doesn't mean someone else who's disabled. That means someone else who has the same disability. Which sounds like nitpicking, but it's really not. When it comes down to it, if people with two totally different disabilities, for example, are being treated badly, especially as a matter of direct discrimination, there's a question as to what exactly this treatment could possibly involve, unless you're going so far so discriminatory as to say, well, I just don't have to say people something like that. Realistically, that doesn't happen often. But note that direct discrimination can also include discrimination by association. A classic example of that would be disability discrimination, treating an employee worse or not making adjustments or something like that because they have someone who they care for with a disability, say a child that needs more hospital appointments, something along those lines. If you treat the employee badly because of that, this is treated as you discriminating on the basis of disability against the employee. So just because they're not protected directly doesn't mean that they wouldn't fall under this. It can also include perception. Someone doesn't need to have a protected characteristic, but if you think they do, you treat them badly as a result. One common example of this, I would say, is, as I mentioned in the last slide, assuming that someone has specific religion or belief because of their race. And it comes to the same. The fact is, here the courts would kind of look at the intent of what you're doing, what you meant by it, I suppose, because it means you're more likely to do it again, as well as anything else. So we'll move on to indirect discrimination, but the bridge between the two would be worth pointing out that you cannot objectively justify direct discrimination, which I'll explain a little more in the next slide. But because I think it's direct, it's generally much more on the surface serious. There's no way to say, but we had to do this. That said, there are exceptions in the Act, which includes direct occupational requirements, which to me very much comes to the same result a lot of the time as objective justification. Does the role require X? So a good example is always people who have been hired to play a role. You're being hired to play a character who, say, is a particular race in a film that is about their treatment because of their race. You're obviously not going to hire someone of a different race. Is that discriminatory? Well, yes, it is. You are saying, I'm not hiring you for this role because you're not the right race. That's discrimination. But it's clearly a genuine occupational requirement of the role. And to me, it's also an objective justification. So while technically you can't include that, if it's at all justifiable, you will hopefully be able to fit it into occupational requirements. Again, there's some nuance to that, some case law to that this is not the venue to get into, but that's the info for you. So indirect discrimination. Not all of that text was meant to pop up at once. Apologies. I realise that's a bit of a wall of text. So that's in the Equality Act, section 19, and that's where, like I mentioned earlier, there's a PCP that puts the employee at a particular disadvantage compared to everyone else who doesn't have that characteristic. Now, there's a lot of nuance to that. It's one that you really have to apply your mind to probably ahead of time. Because of that nuance, it can be objectively justified as long as it's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So a good example of that is probably things like disability. Say someone is totally unable to walk, they apply for a role that involves, say, working in a care home, a lot of walking up and down the ward, a lot of going up and down stairs. Can they do that job? There's a good chance they can't. And that's because being a care worker requires you to be going up and down stairs, be quickly making it to the scene of an emergency. The means of achieving a legitimate aim here would be, of course, the best service possible, the safety of service users. Chances are someone who simply can't make it to them, can't help them in time, isn't going to be able to do that job. So, again, that's maybe a fairly obvious one, but this is one that you really need to think ahead about, and that's maybe where good practice, having good policies, is something that is invaluable. Because if you're doing all of that, if you're thinking ahead the right way, if you've got a lot of these things in the back of your mind, you'll find that hopefully you're not going to be indirectly discriminating against the vast majority of people unless it is necessary. It's something that you can think of as kind of group-based because it's not about the individual. It should apply to all members of specific groups. If I'm indirectly discriminating against women, then it's not against you because you're a woman, it's against all women because they're women. Again, it's useful to think of in that light because it immediately opens up you to more risk. Because if you're discriminating against all people under protected characteristic, chances are that's more than just the one person that's raised this as an issue. So this applies to all protected characteristics, or can be except pregnancy and maternity, but in pregnancy and maternity situations, there's a very good chance that this would be indirect sex discrimination. And frankly, why doesn't this apply to pregnancy and maternity? I'll be honest, that's what the Equality Act says. I suppose most cases will be sex discrimination, however, if it's indirect. If you are, like I said in the last slide, the example I gave was if you don't hire someone who's applying for a role and say it's, oh, I think it's because you might get pregnant in the future, you are most likely discriminating against women here. So I'll go through a couple of examples. This worked a little better when they popped in bullet point by bullet point, but there we go. So if a role requires employees to work full-time, you don't really offer any flexibility about this. Is that indirect discrimination? And if so, who against? This is where we apply our minds and we think, who could that be a detriment to? So case law has held that women are more likely to be carers, caring responsibilities, and are more likely to work part-time. Therefore, anything that doesn't at least consider the option of part-time work, flexible work, or treats such workers worse or better than full-time workers can be held to be indirectly discriminatory against women. Same goes for people with disabilities, older workers who may also be disabled, who simply can't work full-time anymore. But can this be justified? Can this be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim? Possibly. Again, that's the point where get in touch with us, tell us about the role, tell us the details, because it's not enough to simply say it's full-time because that's what the business needs. There needs to be some justification behind that. But we have specific clients that need the same person 5 days a week, every week. Okay, show us the evidence of that. What's the need? What's the service that you provide? Why can't this be done by 2 people that share the week? So think it through, justify it, and if you can't, we'll ask you to do a little more work on that. Also, for example, a disabled employee, if they're dismissed for simply having high sickness absence, there's been no regard given for their condition, there's been no occupational health report, there's been no allowances made. They've reached 10 absences in 6 months. That's when you dismiss people. That's when you dismiss someone else. So your defence, could you say, well, anyone would be dismissed at 10 absences in 6 months, so I'm not treating them worse than I would anyone else. That's the comparative. And this is where it's unlikely to be direct discrimination, because you're not treating them worse because of their disability. It's likely to be indirect discrimination because you're not considering you've got this provision, criterion, or practice, the sickness absence rule, which is putting disabled people at a particular disadvantage because I think it's most likely a tribunal would find that they'd be happy to hold that a disabled employee is more likely to have slightly higher sickness absence than someone else. And again, do we get into justification? Is there a point we get to where we say, we appreciate you have a disability, but we need reliable staff? Yeah, we can go down that road. Again, talk to us about it. So moving on to sort of what we do in practice, how we should approach these situations when they come up. So the most common situations, I would say, where employees will raise the issue of discrimination, where that dreaded word will be used, will be after dismissal or after they resign, if they're going to argue, I was forced to resign. Probably the most common one. A close second being when they raise a grievance or complaint, whether against the company or against a colleague, saying that they have been treated badly and that it's as a result of X. The last one being when they are disciplined or when their performance managed. and all of a sudden it's put to them in the hearing, what's your defence to this? What's your defence to these allegations? What's your defence to this poor performance? That's when they'll turn around and say, oh, it's because of my condition. It's because of X. It's because of Y. So a few things to go through. And again, this is just to get you thinking about what approach you should be taking, what you should be applying your mind to. Did you know about the protected characteristic before that? And would it have changed your approach? And the caveat to that is that actually relevant here, or is something just trying their hand? So say after someone's dismissed, if they turn around and say, I can't believe I was dismissed because even though I have this disability, did you know they had a disability? Is that relevant now? If these things are raised, especially after dismissal and resignation, that's generally going to be too late. You didn't know, and you need, for them to succeed at tribunal, they really need to show that you had working knowledge of the protected characteristic. Otherwise, you'd no way to directly discriminate because you didn't know they had it. And if you indirectly discriminated, it was completely inadvertent because you didn't know that they had this characteristic to suffer from a particular disadvantage. So they really need to have raised this with you before rather than later. And in the case of, is it actually relevant? Yes, it's scary to have dismissed someone and suddenly hear, I can't believe you did this when I have a disability, or I can't believe you fired me despite all that I've been through, despite my race and my sex and everything else. What does that have to do with why we dismissed you? If we dismissed you for falling off and punching someone on the factory floor, it's not a defence to turn around and say, I can't believe you did this. This was discriminatory because of X or Y. And again, that is where chances are it wasn't direct discrimination. But what did you know? What did you know about what's been raised with you before? Yeah, have they identified a clear detriment, a clear disadvantage? If they didn't have this protected characteristic, would they have been treated differently? And I suppose the other version of that question is, should they have been treated differently because of this protected characteristic? One would see most often say disability. Should there have been reasonable adjustments in place that weren't? If there should have been, did you know about the protected characteristic at all? There's also the question of how they raised their complaint, how they raised their issue. Have they followed the grievance procedure in raising a complaint? Because we often put emphasis on, you should have these policies, you should have these procedures, and you should follow them, which you should, but are they following them as well? It is a two-way street. How late is too late for them to disclose? I kind of covered that. Have they said after dismissal, oh, by the way, I have a disability? That's too late. But what about when disciplined, when performance managed? Performance management's a good example. You give them a performance improvement plan, and they say to you, oh, actually, I really struggle with this task. I think I might be dyslexic. I think I might be something else. That's probably not too late. That is maybe the point where you stop and say, okay, let's look into that a little bit. Tell us more about this condition. Yeah, you can ask, why didn't you tell us about this earlier? But you know about it now. They're not at the door yet. Let's look into this in a little more detail, because it could be nonsense, or there could be a reason that they've not wanted to disclose it before now, especially with disability. Especially if it's something mental or something neurological, still a lot of stigma there. We do have to appreciate people do not always feel comfortable disclosing certain conditions. So it's fine to have different approaches for different protected characteristics. Again, you maybe have a little more expectation of being proactive. If someone tells you they have a disability ahead of time, ahead of an issue, then maybe you should be thinking before something happens, are there reasonable adjustments we should consider? Whereas if you have someone and notice that they are a man or woman, do you need to take a particular approach with them? I would hope not. But you do always need to follow a process and make it a consistent process, whether that's consistent across everyone, or consistent with the same protected characteristic. The big risk in cases like this is being arbitrary, being inconsistent. We also have the burden of proof, which I'll talk about in the tribunal slide as well. The burden of proof when someone can claim discrimination is at a certain point reversed, in that you have to prove that you did not discriminate. It's not that they have to prove that they were discriminated against, but to get to that point, they do need a prima facie case, which means they need to have some kind of narrative to reasonably say, I was discriminated against because of X. You can't just play that magic card and say, I have X, prove that I wasn't treated badly because of it. That's not going to work. They do need to be able to say, here's what happened to me. I was forced to take the stairs every day, even though I have crippling issues with my legs. That's discriminatory. If they can say that, if that can be true on the surface, that's when the burden of proof flips, and you have to prove, well, why was that not discrimination? So, of course, this is good practice with everything when it comes to employment, but I appreciate it's asking a lot of yourselves when you're very busy people, I'm sure. Document everything. If you've had these conversations, as soon as one of these scary words has been raised, try to get everything in writing, try to take minutes, and don't be afraid to ask for proof. If someone says, I have this disability, I have this condition, we shouldn't assume that they're lying, but at the same time, we can say, okay, well, what's your proof of this? What's your documentation backing it up? And then we get on to tribunal claims. So discrimination is the most common claim made, other than unfair dismissal. It's often appended to other claims. You'll often see the two of those hand in hand. But unlike unfair dismissal, it doesn't require 2 years service. Again, one that we hear fairly often is, well, this person's under 2 years, we can dismiss them, we can do what we like. Well, no, because, as I said earlier, everyone has protected characteristics. Have any of these been engaged? Have any of these been raised? Is there any way that, as far as you know, that they could be? Because, unlike unfair dismissal, discrimination comes to much, much higher awards. The unfair dismissal reward in itself is, I hate to say low, but it's the same as redundancy pay. It's 1 week for every year of service after 2 years, 1.5 if you're over 40, etc. But in the grand scheme of things, that's not a lot. Now, discrimination claims get you an injury to feelings award, which is decided via the Vento bands, based on case Vento that set these out initially. The lower band, which is the most common one, is 1,200 to 12,100. It's a pretty broad band, I'm sure you realise. Middle band, 12,100 to 36,400. And the upper band is 36,400 to 60,700. And as I said, the award is uncapped, so you have extreme cases over 60,700, and we've seen cases recently that have gone to 1 million. It's very rare, but it does happen, and it's something that I would suggest being very aware of, because the more discriminatory you are, the more that's going to creep up. and that comes to a very, very high sum indeed. It does happen. So what will the process involve at the tribunal, and how do you prove that you didn't discriminate? This is very much a case-by-case basis thing, but normally when a claim comes in citing discrimination, stating that, you will often find, especially if it's someone representing themselves, that they don't really elaborate, not in the level of detail that the tribunal would require. Chances are there will be preliminary hearings at which they really have to set out how this happened. Tribunal would guide them through basically presenting a prima facie case to see whether that can be presented. This is the point where we can say if it's a particularly weak claim, a particularly spurious claim, because it does happen, that they're being put to strict proof. We can challenge it. We can even ask for a deposit order to be made. Obviously, it's free to make a tribunal claim, but this is the point where we can say, no, there's absolutely nothing to this. We want them to be asked to put a deposit down to essentially put their money where their mouth is. And if it turns out there's nothing to this, we're going to come after them for some of their legal costs. And I will say now, tribunals are very, very reluctant to award that, but it's something we can try, and it's not about scaring people off, but yeah, it can make people think, do I really have a claim here? Could this cost me more than my time? At least makes them apply themselves a bit more, because as this webinar will have shown you so far, you've been expected to apply yourself all the way up until now. It's their turn. How you prove you don't discriminate, I appreciate that can be a difficult one to think through, because yes, you're being asked to prove that you didn't think in a certain way. And that's where, as we'll go on to the next slide, it's important to have the right policies in place, to have right training in place to show this is something that we take seriously. This is something that we actively avoid doing. Here's the process we follow. Here's what we do. Ideally, we would be in a position to say there is no scope here to say that we are discriminating. If you can get that far, I'll be very impressed. So what leads to employers losing these claims at tribunal? I would say that the biggest one is not having clear procedure or not following a clear procedure. And we see example after example of this in case law. My colleague Joe, it wasn't a discrimination case, but he did just give us a blog post, I believe, on a recent claim, at least an unfair dismissal claim, I think, where the claim was lost, but it was because the employer did not follow correct procedure. It was a gross misconduct dismissal. They didn't have the right investigations. They didn't hold that to a high standard. They didn't follow their own process. This isn't a finding on any great merit of the employee's actions. This isn't even really saying that the employee did the right thing. It's just saying the employer you didn't have a clear process. And that's where the tribunal will always say, if we have to err on one side or another, we're going to side with the little guy. We're going to side with the employee. So, but if you jump through the right hoops, if you cross the T's and dot the I's, and you can show that you mean it, you're in a very strong position 9 times out of 10. So before we move on to a Q&A, I'll quickly cover, sort of best practice approach here, between making sure that before it comes to that tribunal stage, you're in the best position possible. So have a think about what you have in place. Do you have equality training, especially for managers? So diversity and equality training. This is where I briefly plug the Neat House service. We do offer e-learning on diversity, equality, and inclusion, which we've been rated quite highly by a few clients. So if you don't have that, it's worth having. Because if you don't have it and you get to tribunal, and you're facing one of these accusations, the tribunal is not going to look favourably on you if you say, oh no, we take discrimination very seriously in this workplace. No, we've not bothered to train anyone on it. Do you have fair practices? Do you ensure that those are followed? Do you have a clear grievance procedure? Did you follow it in this case? It's not enough to just have this stuff in writing. You need to show that you take it seriously, that you follow it, that you kind of proactively engage with it. Now, no employer is perfect. A tribunal isn't looking for you to be 100% the most politically correct, if you like, engage, perfect system. Each and every employee, there's always going to be friction, there's always going to be conflict, there's always going to be a manager, a store manager somewhere that goes a little rogue. But if you can show that you've got all of this in place and that this was an aberration, that this wasn't how you do things, 99 times out of 100, then that puts you in a much better position as a company to say, this isn't how we do things. So yeah, you have positive duties. You should be taking reasonable steps to prevent discrimination from happening. A lot of employer handbooks have this as this kind of mission statement to treat other employees with respect, to treat them with dignity. These aren't just meaningless words. What that means, what that is essentially saying is, if you discriminate against another employee, whether a colleague, whether it's someone working underneath you, this isn't sanctioned by us. This is going outside our values. Ideally, if that is what happens, then you are in a position to say, this guy totally acted outside of his job. We don't tolerate discrimination. We retaliated against him. Say it's a manager who discriminated against an employee under them. What did you do with the manager? Because if you disciplined them, chances are it's gross misconduct, but again, case-by-case basis. Then are you going to be held liable as an employer? Unfortunately, that's not a yes or no question, but if you can show that you immediately acted, this person was a rogue agent, if you like, then you're in the best position possible. Preventing sexual harassment, like I mentioned earlier, that is now an active responsibility that you have. As of last September, October, when that came into play, you need to take reasonable steps to an environment in which sexual harassment can flourish. You need to take risk assessments. You should have a policy. And to me, it's good practice to have a similar approach for most obvious cases of discrimination. You should be able to show that you are, for example, a disability-friendly workplace, because this benefits everyone. And obviously you have reasonable adjustments. Someone tells you they have a condition. The first question should be, is there anything we should be doing? Is there anything we should consider? The flip side of that being, if they say no, then get that in writing. Because a lot of people have conditions. I have medical conditions myself. The first thing I told them when I joined Neat House was, hey, I have type 1 diabetes. There's nothing you need to do about it. I work from home. I can manage myself. They don't have to make reasonable adjustments for that. But that's different for everyone. Someone who works on the shop floor, for example, and has less well-controlled diabetes, they're maybe going to need to take breaks if their blood sugar goes low. They need to tell you about this. So it does go both ways. So I think what I've made clear here is that this has to be a little more than a box-ticking exercise. If you have training in place, e-learning in place, it's not enough to just make someone do a couple of e-learning modules and then lean back and say, well, we can't possibly be a workplace in which discrimination happens. Look at all the e-learning we've done. A tribunal will see right through that, and rightly so. They will ask what you do in practice, how you put your best practice where your e-learning is, because it's very easy to just click through that, try the multiple choice quiz at the end a few times until you get it right and not think about it again. What have you taken from? Treating employees consistently, like I mentioned a couple of times. If you're treating someone differently to others, maybe it's just because you don't like them, maybe it's because they've not earned goodwill, and we get it. There are employees that have done a lot for the company that really go above and beyond. Maybe you let them away with a little bit more, you let them away with something that their colleague who has burned a lot of goodwill wouldn't get away with, but either be able to show that, or you could be in trouble when they turn around and say, he got away with this, why didn't I get away with it? Also, my manager has made some comments recently, homophobic comments. Is this about my sexuality? Once you're in that position, even if you haven't put all of these dots together, it paints a very unflattering picture. So yeah, really the focus here needs to be have these policies and procedures in place, show that people have been trained properly, and when grievances are raised, take them seriously, act on them promptly. Finally, some sort of common pitfalls that you can come across. These should be obvious, but it's good to bear them in mind. It's good to have them here in front of you because we do see it all the time. And like I mentioned earlier, when it comes to case law, this is the sort of thing that a tribunal would take and say, did not follow your own procedures here. This left a lot of doubt as to your story, as to your defence. I think there's something here. And then they're going to look at you in more detail. They're going to ask you more pointed questions. And even if you don't think they've done anything wrong, that's not the situation you want to be in. So if you're not following your own procedure, if you're not following the ACAS guidelines, now your disciplinary procedure, for example, should not conflict with the ACAS guidelines at least, and those have statutory effect. A tribunal will apply them. If you don't follow the ACAS guidelines, it's not an offence to just say you followed your own, because they shouldn't be conflicting. Someone's been complaining, someone's been raising a grievance, even if they've not said, I want to raise a formal grievance, you will be asked, why didn't you raise an investigation? It's clear this person was complaining about a very serious matter. Ignoring evidence when you do deal with a grievance, picking and choosing between it so you can deny it or downplay it, not acting on it when you do uphold it. It's not enough to just say, the grievance is upheld, that person did treat you badly. Okay, what next? You're not upholding it, you need to give the right to appeal, you need to take an appeal just as seriously. Things like not giving them the right to be accompanied. I suppose that's ACAS guidelines, isn't it? But if someone raises a grievance, you can't just say to them, okay, come and meet with me, we'll have a chat, we'll sort this out. No, it's a formal hearing. You have the right to be accompanied. And especially if they're claiming something like, say, disability, or even that the company, say, doesn't take women as seriously when they complain as they do men, it's fatal potentially to say, right, let's just have a quick chat about it, and then not listen to them. Inconsistency. I've banged that drum a few times now, but have you taken X's complaints more seriously than you have Y's? If so, why? Documentation and record keeping. It's a difficult ask to say, treat everything like it could end up at tribunal. But it's important, as soon as the potential spectre of discrimination is raised, to make sure that you're documenting this. If someone says they have a condition, I would take minute notes. You don't want to scare them off, but if they ask why you're doing it, the answer is, quite honestly, because I want to be able to show that I'm taking this seriously. And the last one is, not considering reasonable adjustments, like I discussed. But while those are mainly for disability, it's something worth considering for a lot of protected characteristics. For example, one good example that I've heard a few times, that I've been asked a few times, is Muslims asking for breaks to pray during the working day. Do we need to offer that? Unless there's some good reason, but that's not possible, then yes, you should try to allow small breaks. But there will be cases where you can't do that, cases where they need to be at their desk working or keeping an eye on a critical patient or something all the time. You can't afford to have them take 10-minute, 15-minute breaks a couple of times a day. If that's the case, that's your defence. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of a very complex topic. We'll move on now. I'll take some questions. I'll try to get through as many as I can. So, first question we've got here is from Rachel Fay. Can you ask someone if they have plans to have a baby in the near future once you've offered them the job for the purposes of planning ahead? I'd say once the job has been offered, as long as there's no intention or no possibility that you could then hold back the job, you have more leeway to ask questions like that. It shouldn't be asked in an interview, because then if you then don't offer them the job, it leaves an open goal for them to say, well, that's because I said that, that's because I was asked that. But once they're in the job, then it's one to approach very, very tactfully and be very careful about doing it. But certainly you can say, you know, what are your plans for the future? Are there any possible, you know, long breaks or anything in the near future? I'd be careful about asking about having a child, especially. But you have a little more leeway in that context to ask that. Right, Claire Donaldson. Recruiting for full-time roles, interested to know whether a charity with limited funds can justify a full-time requirement, as it costs more to have two people covering hours than one person. For example, they get the same benefits package, but it costs us for two people and not one. Yes, that would be a justification. And that's something tribunals do take into account. If you're a small charity, you're relying on funds, you're a small company with maybe 5, 6 people, you're not expected to have the same flexibility and resources as Amazon, as Tesco, something like that. So that's one to set out when it's asked. I want to work remotely, flexibly, I want to reduce to part-time hours, or this job has to be full-time hours. If you can clearly show with evidence that it would cost you more, then yeah, that's absolutely a defence. And it's like I said about evidence, it's being able to evidence that, it's being able to show that. Ideally, you'd maybe be able to show that we've tried this and it cost us too much and it didn't work. So, good question 3 here, but I just see Nicola Pepper asked, is it fair to say you wouldn't ask a male employee if he's planning a baby? How can asking a female be justified and not seen as discriminatory? Sorry. Sorry, I've been coughing throughout this. I thought that was shifted, but apparently not. Maybe I'm talking too much. No, that's a good point. And yeah, I would agree. I think if it's kind of what I was trying to say in my answer there, but I'll elaborate on it. If that's a question you're going to ask, it should be asked of everyone. That's why I said it's fine to ask people part of onboarding if you're planning any long breaks, anything like that in the near future that we need to know about. But if you're just asking female employees, are you planning to have a baby? Then yeah, that's going to be discriminatory. Now, are they going to know that you don't ask that of men? I think they might have a good idea. I can't believe that as a woman, I was asked if I'm planning to have a baby in the near future. That's not a good look if that's what you're being accused of. So something to approach very, very carefully, and I'd keep it as neutral as possible. Have you got any big holidays lined up? Have you got any big breaks in future? Anything that we need to be aware of like that? That's their opportunity to say, you know, in a year or so's time, I was thinking of trying for a child. If they say that, if they raise that to you, then that's very, very different. That's them opening that conversation. But I would not go straight in any case and just say, are you intending to have a baby? Right. Question three. So I hope that elaborates a little. I should maybe have explained that a little more clearly. Question three, Justin Twiss. I can see Salt suggesting maybe one to give it a call on. Investigating a grievance against senior leaders by an MD, allegations about recruiting for the successor while still in post. Yeah, I'll be honest, it's obviously a very specific query about a case that you've got, a case that you're dealing with. I'm not sure if you are currently a client of ours, apologies, but that's definitely one to raise with your advisor if you are, because this is getting into very much let's delve into this case with a lot more detail. So apologies, but yeah, one to go through case by case with your advisor. Right, question 4, Steve Gean. How do you deal with reframing events after dismissal, events being interpreted after exit, and post references being used to obtain new employment? No grievance being raised at the time, job made redundant due to financial pressures on the business and a sole job holder, now claiming unfair based on race, gender, disability, and whistleblowing. So I think that's another example of if this has all come up after dismissal, after redundancy, then it's very, very late to be raising it. But this is a situation where it's ultimately it's free to make a tribunal claim. I don't know if this person has made a tribunal claim or if they're just raising noise just now, but if you can show at least that this isn't something that was at all raised during the redundancy consultation, then you're in a strong position to say this was never an issue during employment. And there is merit at that point to just saying, you know what, if you want to make an appeal against redundancy, against your dismissal, then go ahead and we can hear these points out. If the appeal's been done or we're way out of time for that, then this is the point where you, like I said earlier, don't panic. And if you're feeling brave, say to them, okay, we totally deny any of that. Talk to ACAS. We're happy to talk to them as well. Make your claim if you want, and we can respond. Because a lot of the time people will say these things in the hope that you get a fright, that you offer them some money to go away. It's up to you whether you do that or not. I think Joe did a webinar or a blog post on that as well, the fight or fold topic. But if you show that you're not backing down, that you're not scared, a lot of the time someone that's making spurious allegations, if that's what's happening here, will go away with their tail between their legs, they'll shrug and say, well, I gave it a go. Question from Wendy, if we are in an ET situation and weeks go by without hearing from the court and our emails are going unanswered, what do we do? It's probably not what you want to hear, but that's a question that we've asked ourselves a few times. The tribunals are very overburdened at the moment. ACAS especially is not reaching out a lot of the time when there's a claim in, when early conciliation's been raised, and it's very, very frustrating. It's frustrating for us as well. To get through, your best bet is to call the tribunal, keep calling them, try to get through to them. But this is a very, very common occurrence at the moment, and it's very, very difficult to deal with, is all I can say to that. You're certainly not alone. Right, we get time for a few more questions, I think, Sol. Oh, maybe not. So apologies. I can see there were lots of questions coming in there, and yeah, as Sol says, some of them quite specific. These are ones probably to raise with your advisor directly. That's what we're here for. And if you're not directly a client of ours, then hopefully I've encouraged you to maybe have a chat with Neat House and see what we can offer. Because this is, like I say, a very, very complex topic. That was a whirlwind tour. A few points that you'll remember, I did say, you know what, I don't intend to cover this, but it's very nuanced. We could probably easily have done a full webinar, a full webinar on each of the slides that I covered here today, but that's what our advice is for. So further questions, and I'm sure you've got some, come to us, we'll have a chat about them, and hope to hear from a few of you.